My name is Joyce Shediak, and this is Bill Dories. I'm the editor of this book, GAZA, Symbol of Resistance. Bill Dories is speaking from Al Auda. We're talking about solidarity with Palestine, breaking the blockade. Bill has been is a long-time activist in the Palestinian struggle and has been on the Viva Palestina contingent to Gaza and broke the blockade. I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue and why I put together this book, which is a compilation of writings by 17 activists, myself included, on the situation in relationship to Gaza, starting with the elections that Hamas won in 2006, and moving through the Israeli attack on the Freedom Flotilla, which was last May, the end of last May. And as I kind of studied the situation and read some reports, that I found what I felt was a story that the media, the establishment media, was not covering here, or maybe covering sporadically, or maybe you had to be a detective and pull out all the newspapers and look for the storyline and see what was going on. And I felt it was important to put together. And what I found was how systematically the U.S. government and the major European powers have squeezed Gaza, have squeezed the Palestinians, starting from, and I'm just talking about this recent period, documenting this recent period. Before the Hamas elections, there were many attacks on Arafat, on the West Bank, and they systematically blamed the Palestinians for it, and then it accelerated with the election of Hamas, and that Gaza, the people of Gaza, were in fact punished for exerting a full democratic election and choosing Hamas, and this is all documented. Jimmy Carter called the Palestinians' elections some of the freest and fairest he has ever seen, and he spent his second career, so to speak, monitoring elections. This culminated in the terrible 3-week bombing of Gaza. And all of the major powers either sat on their hands and did nothing, or were totally complicit in it and just turned the other way. And the people of the world and the people of these countries grew so horrified that they decided to break the blockade. And the ones in the twos and the hundreds, and some countries the thousands, that the people of the world were not for this blockade, they were not for the massacre of the Palestinians, and through their own heroic effort, and often at great risk to their own lives, they went via sea and via land, fighting the Egyptian government, sometimes physically, being threatened to be left in the Sinai desert by Egyptian soldiers, and they broke the blockade and brought supplies to Gaza. And that a movement has developed to assist Gaza. It's totally grassroots, and it's virtually not known in this country. So the book documents this whole process. It's written by grassroots people. It's written by activists. It's written in the spirit of struggle. It's written in the spirit of community. It's written in the spirit of ending the blockade of Gaza as enriching our own lives as human beings, as activists in the world that we want to live, and as part of our own fight for decent lives, to use the money that goes to arm Israel, that goes to arm Egypt, that goes to arm Saudi Arabia against the people of the area, to meet human needs at home. Now, this is a story that I found, and it's a story that I've put together. Anyway, that's essentially the book. Do you want to say something? I want to talk about a chapter, but he's got to give me back the book because I want to. Excuse me. So, I mean, essentially, well, why doesn't everybody know this? I know a lot of the people in the room have a piece of this, have a view of it. It may not be the same view that I have, but it's like a diamond. We all have a facet, and maybe we agree on some and maybe we don't. But I think we will agree that you often start from scratch when you go in the streets, you know. Part of the book deals with the complicity of the media, the U.S. establishment media, in kind of hiding this narrative, and why this is so. For instance, the whole question about the threat posed by rockets from Gaza. There was just an article in the New York Times on the 16th, which was, today's what, that's in the middle of the week. That it says here that Israel's three-week military offensive in January 2009 came after years of persistent rocket fire from Gaza against southern Israel. Like that was the cause and effect relationship. Now, this has been disproven repeatedly even in the establishment media, even in the New York Times. And Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting has done a series of articles on how the media kind of goes back to square one, that maybe in the heat of events they will write a story that reflects what's going on the ground, but one that's all over, they go back to square one. And they kind of misremember, and this is in the words of Fair, what happened during the 2008-2009 Gaza war, and what were the causes of it. For instance, this is what the Times said, you know, about rockets that like these rockets that are threatening the south, that Gaza poses a great threat to the south of Israel. This is a December 19th, 2008 New York Times article that reports that Hamas had been, quote, largely successful in seriously curtailing rocket fire from Gaza. Same newspaper. Quote, Hamas imposed its will and even imprisoned some who were firing the rockets. An editorial in the Washington Post said the same thing. So the media has a perspective that seems to be very different from the facts. They seem to forget what went on and then report a different story that seems to be very pro-Israel. And some people have complained that well, they're doing Israel's bidding. I maintain something else. I maintain that there are financial interests to the media, that they interlock with the oil companies, with the military establishment that profits from the Gaza war, and that they reflect an economic and political perspective of the ruling circles of a whole in the U.S., that there's not an independent media, that the media is a for-profit institution, and that this guise of fairness and accuracy by the establishment media does not really exist. And it is documented here, I believe. For instance, there's a media monopoly. The media has a view, well, there's all these kind of rough and ready reporters like Anderson Cooper that go into the field and they can get beaten up, you know, by the right wing at Tahrir Square, and they're telling the truth of what's going on in the ground. But that's kind of just for public consumption. It's not a series of individual reporters, it's a series of corporations who hire people who are pretty good at kind of giving the line that they want when they want to get it. At the end of World War II, there were 80% of the dailies in the U.S. were independently owned. Today, there are only 5 companies that control most of the television, radio, magazines, newspapers, videos, photo agencies, wire services in this country. And General Electric's NBC is a close 6. NBC, owned by General Electric, an arms producer. These monopolies are very big. Times Warner has 292 separate companies and subsidiaries. ABC TV has 10 owned and operated stations, 30 radio stations, 11 cable channels, 13 internet broadcasting channels, 17 internet sites and more, and the others are similar. The extent of the monopolization is well hidden. They're all related to each other and related to other corporations. There are 118 people that sit on the boards of the 10 biggest media giants, who in turn sit on the boards of 288 national and international corporations. So they're all related through interlocking directorates. And 8 of the 10 biggest media giants share common membership on each other's boards of directors. And this integration occurs on the very pinnacle of power. For instance, members of ABC Disney, NBC GE, CBS Viacom, CNN, Fox, New York Times and the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Gannett, and Knight Ridder sit on the board of 13 of the Fortune 500's 25 most profitable companies and probably have indirect connections to the other 12. So this is a huge matrix of interlocking monopolies who wind up having very, very similar interests and sometimes exactly the same interests. So which corporations benefit the most from vilifying the Palestinians and other people of the Middle East? Which corporations make the most profits out of the Middle East? By far, it's the oil companies. ExxonMobil and Chevron, the first and second largest oil companies, top the Fortune 500 list. Exxon reported the highest annual profits in history in 2006. The next year it broke its own record, clearing over $40 billion or nearly $1,300 a second. As of July 1st, 2010, ExxonMobil occupied 8 of the 10 slots for the largest corporate quarterly profits earned in all times, and 5 of the 10 annual corporate earning slots of all times. Chevron and Conoco, the second and third largest of the U.S. oil companies, are not far behind. While these companies drill and profit all over the world, their empire, so to speak, is based in the Gulf of the Middle East. It's based in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and once again in Iraq. No longer in Iran, but once again in Iraq. And these companies see the Palestinian question, which is the kind of the core of the Middle East, as a threat to their profits, kind of a long-term threat to their profits, to maintaining control in the area. Now, the media often is directly connected to the oil companies. In 1944, when the U.S. became the dominant power in the Middle East, the U.S. State Department described Middle Eastern oil as a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in history. Well, U.S. officials kind of regard it the same way now. We all remember Dick Cheney, George Bush's Secretary of Defense, before his stint at Halliburton. Before his stint at the government, he worked for Halliburton, and he once drew parallels between his role as a CEO of Halliburton and his role as Secretary of Defense, addressing a geological oil specialist. He said, "In the oil and gas business, I deal with many of the same people that I dealt with in the U.S. government." So understanding the needs and wants of the oil companies is a big, important part of being a high official in the U.S. government. And some of us may remember that Condoleezza Rice prepared for her role as George Bush's national security advisor and then Secretary of State by first representing Chevron on the board of directors and even headed that company's Committee on Public Policy. So she was the Secretary of State for Chevron before she was Secretary of State for the U.S. government. The oil companies are meshed in with the huge Pentagon apparatus. Conveniently, the Pentagon is the largest consumer of oil in the world. And the media companies are not far behind. Many of them are interlocked with both the military establishment and with oil. General Electric, which is NBC, interlocks with Mobil, CNN with Chevron, Knight Ridder with Phillips Petroleum, and the New York Times with Texaco. Even some of the public stations, which maintain a better reputation than the more establishment medias, are connected with big oil. Chevron is a key funder of the most influential show on PBS, the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Some call it a media industrial, a military complex. If you follow FAIR, you'll see this term out. So how do the weapons companies influence the media? Well, they take big ads out. Lockheed Martin is a major advertiser on CNN, which is owned by Time Warner. And some media is actually owned by the arm merchants. As I said, NBC is owned by General Electric. GE makes the propulsion systems on U.S. aircraft sold to the Israeli Air Force. So that when reporters and analysts and guests at NBC find excuses to justify Israeli attacks on Gaza, or kind of go back to the position that, well, it's the rockets from Gaza that make Israel drop masses of weapons on Gaza. They don't mention their salaries are paid by the companies that make a mint profiting from the very weapons that Israel uses. And that NBC does not make a cent from exposing the terrible toll these weapons have taken on the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people of Gaza. Also, we see that the media has become, the military has become more and more a part of the media. All these generals they have on as experts, Pentagon spokespeople, more and more. In the last war in Iraq, there were no media representatives except those who were embedded with the troops, just giving the U.S. perspective. So the media itself is objectively more to the right. And what about these weapons that go to these different countries? Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. aid and the largest recipient of weapons, followed by Egypt and by Saudi Arabia. But these weapons, this aid is 90% of it goes to weaponry. And the weapons, there's already a contract that the weapons are purchased by U.S. companies, by Lockheed Martin, here. Frida Berrigan, a senior researcher at the Royal Policy Institute, says the U.S. Military arms assistance transfer to Israel, that there are 10 weapons corporations that have a stake in Israel using its military arsenal so that it can be replenished again. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Caterpillar, although not directly a military company, made the bulldozer that was used to kill Rachel Corrie in Gaza a few years ago. She's an American who stood in front of an Israeli bulldozer that was going to bulldoze a home as a peaceful protest, and the bulldozer ran her over. Well, it was not an Israeli bulldozer, it was sent from Caterpillar. Raytheon, and the media are directly interlinked with these companies. And these companies profit by having their weapons used against the Palestinian people and replenished. The Disney company, which is ABC News, has a direct interlink with Boeing. Lockheed Martin has interlocking directorates with the Washington Post and Gannett. Caterpillar with the Tribune Company, owner of the Chicago Tribune and the Los Angeles Times. Raytheon with the New York Times. This is just something that's in the book that's not usually talked about why we don't get the story that when you look at, as objective people, we look at it and we see is going on in the Middle East, why we're not getting it from the media. So.
Got to apologize. Some of our speakers are not here. Councilman Barron, who traveled to Gaza with us in 2009, is not able to be here, and neither is Ralph Loeffler, who was going to show a slideshow about his trips to Gaza. I've been in Gaza 2 times. The first time was with Joyce in 1988 as part of a delegation with the Palestine Solidarity Committee during the first Intifada, the first uprising of the Palestinian people en masse against Israeli rule inside Palestine. And at that time, Gaza was still under direct Israeli occupation. That meant there was Gaza is the most densely populated place on earth, especially the Jabalia camp, the largest refugee camp in Gaza. That's 1.5 million, maybe more, 1.6 million people crammed into a 28 square mile strip by the Mediterranean. At that time, the strip was under curfew. Israeli soldiers routinely kicked down doors and tore up people's homes and routinely stood on rooftops and shot people down in cold blood, and we witnessed this. It seemed like we were there for 3 days. It was a round of visiting families whose children had been shot. We met a young baby, a baby who had lost his eye, a rubber bullet lodged in his eye, and then the Israeli officer came over and yanked it out, and the eyeball came with it. Meanwhile, a huge portion of the land area of Gaza was occupied at that time by Israeli settlements. Most of the settlers, by the way, are from the United States. They're not even born in Israel. And while people in Gaza had to line up, while people in the camps had to line up for water from common spigots, and living in these overcrowded camps, the settlements looked like suburban Long Island with lawn sprayers just freely splashing water everywhere. The majority of the main income for the people of Gaza at that time was work inside Israel. And remember that the majority of people of Gaza are refugees or the children and grandchildren of refugees, people who lived in where is now Tel Aviv, where is now in that part of Israel on the coast, and who were driven from their land at gunpoint in 1948 and wound up in these refugee camps. And under the occupation, they could only return to the land in which they were born as hired day laborers who would come to pick the oranges, to clean the streets, to build the luxury hotels and condos that line the coast north of Tel Aviv and Herzliya and Caesarea. And if they were caught in Israel after sundown, they would go to jail. It was like the signs that used to exist in towns in the southern United States that told black people, "Don't be caught in this town after sundown." And many did take the risk of spending the night because they were working 10, 12-hour days and suffered horribly as a result. I mean, not only imprisonment, but sometimes being murdered. In 2005, Israel felt forced to compelled to move out or withdraw from Gaza, both by the resistance and by the cost of the occupation. And instead, and when Gaza held what was today, we see a democratic uprising taking place across the Arab world. But the first truly democratic election to take place in the Arab world in recent memory was in Palestine in 2006, and it elected the majority of the people voted for a political party, Hamas, which that election, that democratic choice, has earned Gaza, put Gaza under siege and a blockade, and finally a massive bloody assault that we saw in January of 2009, where 1,400 people died, thousands more were injured. It was carried out by the most horrible weapons made by some of the companies that Joyce was talking about, like the dense inert metal explosive device, which can surgically slice off a limb. It's an explosive that just cuts like a knife. And of course, the white phosphorus, which a little granule of it gets into your lungs. It just burns its way through till you die. There's nothing that can be done about it. Napalm, cluster bombs, fuel air explosives that are the next most powerful thing to a nuclear bomb. That they're called vacuum bombs. They create a vacuum, and they can actually destroy people's internal organs. All this was unleashed supposedly in response to basically what are homemade rockets that were themselves a protest against the blockade that was keeping food and medicine from the people of Gaza. The second time I was in Gaza was in July of 2009, 6 months after the onslaught, and I went with Viva Palestina, the aid convoy to Gaza that was organized by by British MP George Galloway. The first convoy went from London shortly after the invasion. It left London in February, arrived in Gaza in March, and it traveled down through Spain across North Africa, picking up such support along the way that the Egyptian government, which was collaborating under Hosni Mubarak, was collaborating in the blockade of Gaza, felt compelled to open the gates and let the convoy in. The second convoy was from the United States, Viva Palestina USA. That's the one I was on. Councilman Charles Barron came with us. Former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, who had just gotten out of an Israeli jail because she was on a ship in June of 2009 that was going to Gaza, along with Irish Nobel Prize winner Mairead Maguire, and there were 7 other U.S. citizens on the ship. There were Irish people. There were people from all over Europe. Israeli commandos boarded that ship and kidnapped her at gunpoint, took her and the others to jail in Israel, and there was not a word in the New York Times, virtually not a word from the media, when Councilman Barron called the White House to protest. The White House said, "Send us more information, we'll look into it," like they didn't know this had happened. A former congressman of the United States was kidnapped and taken to prison on the high seas, international waters, taken to prison in Israel, and the U.S. government is silent, and the U.S. media is silent. Imagine, say, if Iran had done something like that. The ship would never have made it to port. But of course, and of course then a year later, we saw the assault on the Mavi Marmara, this Turkish ship where Israeli commandos boarded it and murdered 9 people, including a U.S. citizen, Furkan Dogan, born in Troy, New York, who was pinned down and shot in the head after he was already wounded, and he was videoing the attack. Clearly, all this has the complete carte blanche approval of the United States government, which has never cut one dime from aid to Israel, no matter what Israel has done, and Israel remains the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the world, as Joyce pointed out. And It's not. It's roughly the aid. It's like roughly $3 billion a year. It varies slightly from year to year in mostly military aid. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's also the fact that the U.S. military buys. Israeli companies are among the few in the world that are allowed to build on top security contracts in the United States. The United States military buys almost as much from the Israeli military as the U.S. gives to Israel, so that almost doubles the amount of aid. And then thirdly, you have the double dipping. For example, when Joyce and I were in Palestine, we rarely saw the very excellent, if you can use such a term for a weapon like that, Galil rifle that's made by Israel. All the Israeli soldiers were carrying M16s made by the United States, provided for free. I did see Galil rifles later in South Africa because Israel supplied them to the apartheid regime. So therefore, the U.S. provided the weapons free to Israel. Israel sold them to South Africa. The U.S. was embarrassed to openly aid apartheid South Africa and did it through Israel. And Israel has played that role in many parts of the world, doing jobs that the United States government would like to do, but is embarrassed to do openly, supporting, like arming apartheid South Africa, arming the white supremacist regime in so-called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, the Duvalier government in Haiti, the Pinochet regime in Chile, the Guatemalan death squad regime, all armed by Israel, while Israeli weapons go to them and U.S. weapons go to Israel. That's one of the reasons the United States so adamantly supports Israel. There's few other countries, and there's really no other country in the world that could really play that role. What is it about this election, this democratic election that took place in Palestine and that was not recognized in the West Bank, and in fact, a number of elected members of parliament from Hamas are now in prison in Israel. They were elected, they were in the West Bank, they were imprisoned at Israel's demand by the Palestine Authority government on the West Bank, also subsidized by the United States. And then Israeli troops came in, smashed into the prison, and kidnapped those political prisoners and took them into prison in Israel. What is it about this election that so horrified not only the Israeli state, but the United States, that they were so determined to crush the popular will of the people of Gaza? Because it's rare in human history that you've seen such a collection of so much force arrayed against this small, heroic enclave of 1.6 million people, of this 1.6 million mostly refugees living in these camps. So much force arrayed against them. When we were in Gaza in July of 2009, the homes that had been destroyed by the bombing had not been rebuilt because concrete was not allowed to come in. Cynthia McKinney's ship was carrying toys. Chocolate was not even allowed into Gaza. Why are they so determined, the powers that be so determined to crush this enclave of resistance? And really it's because Gaza stands for something that is intolerable both to the Israeli state, to the Israeli apartheid state, and to its main backers in the United States, as well as in Western Europe, the Sarkozy regime in France, for example. And that is because the party that was elected in Palestine, popularly elected, has refused to relinquish the Palestinian people's right to return, the right of the people who were forced from their land in 1948 and their children and grandchildren to go back to the land on which they lived and to live as free and equal citizens in every part of Palestine. And that's really the crux of the struggle at this point. There were demonstrations across Palestine on March 15th, a few days ago. March 15th is the anniversary of that Israeli raid on the prison in 2000, it was 5 years ago, where they kidnapped the imprisoned Hamas lawmakers, as well as Ahmad Sadat, who is the General Secretary of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. And The demand was for a call for national unity of all Palestinian forces, an end to the Oslo agreements, and for unity around Palestinian national rights, including the right to return. The right to return would change the character of the state, the apartheid state that now exists in Israel. It would mean a democratic, secular state in Palestine is something that not only the rulers of Israel, but the powers that be in the United States find intolerable. You know, right now, a lot has changed since in the last few months, even since the assault on the Mavi Marmara. And it's been changed from the avenue we most hoped for but least expected. And that was the huge upsurge of the Arab masses that swept the Arab world, beginning in Tunisia, and now it's in Yemen. We see fighting in the streets where 50 people were massacred yesterday, in Bahrain, where Saudi troops have invaded. And right now, as a result of the Egyptian people's struggle, the border is more or less open. It's not being advertised, but there is, for the first time in several years, there is free flow of traffic into Gaza from Egypt. We don't know how long that will last because we don't know how the struggle will play out in Egypt. We know that the Egyptian military is still being paid by the United States. When we were trying to get into Gaza in July, both the Egyptian government and the U.S. Embassy put every conceivable obstacle in our way. At one point, they stopped us at the Suez Canal and said, you have to go back and get documents from the U.S. Embassy saying that you relinquish consular protection because you can't get that in Gaza. So we went back, spent 3 days getting all our people, paying money to the embassy.
How many people?
200 people, roughly. And then we got to Gaza, and there was nobody even wanted to see the documents. We arrived at the crossing in the morning. They kept us there till midnight so that when we entered, the electricity would be off, and the tens of thousands who had turned out to welcome us would no longer be there. Let's see. Anyway, the change in from the beginning, from the beginning even of the project. Remember, Israel was created in 1948, and it was created by the eviction of the majority of the people of Palestine from their homes. It was the culmination of a colonization process that began in 1898 with the First World Zionist Congress in Switzerland, and the idea of setting up a European Jewish state in Palestine. And this was an idea that the formulators of this project, the founders of modern Zionism, men like Theodor Herzl, Max Nordau, to the right of them, Vladimir Jabotinsky, from the beginning sold their project to various colonial powers. People like Cecil Rhodes, who created Rhodesia. They approached the British, Britain. They approached the Kaiser of Germany. They approached every European power that had colonies in Asia or Africa, and said, "We want some land, not in your country. We want some land in Asia or Africa." It wasn't necessarily Palestine. At some point, they talked about Madagascar. They talked about Uganda. They talked about Cyprus. But if you give us land in your colony, we will be your loyal servants against the people who live there. Vladimir Jabotinsky put it this way. Do I have the quote? Oh, I guess I don't have the quote. But anyway, basically, the essence of the quote was that if Palestine were to become independent, it would follow the orbit of Arab destinies and become part of the region. But a Jewish Palestine will inevitably lean on some foreign power, and this will be a blessing. And if that power is England, England will forever have an agent in the region. Today, it's not England; it's the United States. But the United States is terrified of the revolutionary wave that's sweeping the Arab world. And the last time something like that happened, it was the 1950s and 60s, beginning with the Egyptian Revolution led by Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952 to 56, the Algerian War for Independence from France, the Iraqi Revolution of 1958 that overthrew the U.S.-backed Hashemite monarchy in Iraq, and a nationalist revolutionary wave was sweeping the Arab world, and it was the 1967 war that Israel launched against Egypt and Syria and Jordan that basically stopped that wave. The United States supports a lot of brutal, oppressive governments around the world. You know, they supported the Shah of Iran. He's gone. They supported Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. He's gone. The value of a state that identifies entirely not with the West. When Hamas was first elected in 2006, one Israeli politician said, "We in the West could never understand how this could happen, how people could vote like this," and that's the psychology of the Israeli apartheid state. What our role here has to be is to demand an end to the blockade. Remember, Gaza, although the blockade is down, at least for the moment in Egypt, there is still a no-fly zone over Gaza as far as planes coming in. The waters are still controlled. Fishing was a big industry in Gaza, still are limited, can only go 3 miles out, and sometimes not even that. The waters are still poisoned by the runoff from the sewage plants destroyed by the bombing in 2009. And at any time, Israel could launch a new attack, and depending on what happens in the rest of the Arab world, that attack may become more likely. Lebanon is also under threat. Our job here is to demand an end to all U.S. Military and economic aid to the apartheid state of Israel, to get the U.S. 6th Fleet out of the Mediterranean and the U.S. 5th Fleet out of Bahrain and the Gulf, and to allow the people of the region to determine their destiny, because without the endless flow of U.S. arms and dollars, even what is about $10 billion a year may not sound like much in a time when they're giving bankers trillions, but it's really the cutting edge, the most devastating military technology that they're supplying to Israel. And if that stops, and if the special privileges that Israel enjoys as far as tax-exempt collections in this country, including for the Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces, which is chaired by the CEO of Bed Bath & Beyond, his name escapes me at the moment, or the fact that U.S. citizens can serve in the Israeli army, which is not allowed in any other country in the world. If that is ended, the apartheid state would collapse, and the Palestinian people would be able to win their rights, and that's the key thing. For me is and the organization I represent, ALAUDA, the New York, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, is for the right of the Palestinian people, of all Palestinians, to return to their homes and live in freedom and equality in any part of Palestine. Anything less than that is apartheid. It's still apartheid.
One thing about this book, and another thing that the media is very quiet about, is Jewish opposition to what the U.S. and Israeli governments are doing, of which there is plenty. But just as they don't give a fair break to the Palestinians as a rule, one of the things that's censored out is our response and our movement, and also two things: Jewish opposition, both in Israel and around the world, because the media wants to give the impression that the Israeli government represents Jewish people in Israel and elsewhere. So in the book, we have American Jews because it focuses on U.S. opposition, and we have opposition in Israel that's documented here. And also, I just want to pass around this picture of Firkin Dohan. Am I saying the name right? Firkin Dohan? She's busy. What? Dohan. Well, anyway, I don't think I can say that. Do people know that name? He was the American who was killed when Israelis stormed the Freedom Flotilla. He has dual Turkish-American citizenship, and we should know it. But why don't we know it? Because it wasn't publicized. Can you imagine if a Palestinians came with guns and killed Americans on a ship? Wouldn't we know the name of everyone? Wouldn't we know everything about their families, about their aspirations? Well, here is a young American who was shot in the face by Israeli soldiers for the crime of being on a ship bringing, humanitarian aid to Gaza, and we don't know him. There was no U.S. government statement, no condolences to his family, no elected officials that came to visit his family or said anything. It was buried, but the movement has taken up his name and along with the name of Rachel Corrie and other Americans who have sacrificed themselves for humanitarian reasons to free Gaza and to free Palestine. He was not even 19 years old. He had everything before him, and he was shot down in cold blood just for being on that ship.
Well, Al-Awda is a Palestinian, majority Palestinian-led organization in the United States, but which has non-Palestinian members, obviously, including myself, and including a number of Jewish members. There are also a number of active, specifically Jewish organizations fighting against the occupation, such as the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network is one. J Street, to my knowledge, does not support the right to return.
That's not true.
Well, send me that information. But we've had on the question of the Holocaust. I don't know there is a definition by the UN of a Holocaust. Palestinian people normally say a Nakba, which means catastrophe, referring to the events of 1948, which are ongoing, the expulsion of the majority of Palestinians from their land. Basically, our view is that of Al-Awda and of the majority of people in Palestine, and the majority of Palestinians, at least half of whom do not live in Palestine. Many who live inside Palestine are still refugees. Half the population lives in refugee camps in Jordan or Lebanon, or lives in Egypt, or is dispersed around the world, including in the United States. And then there's several hundred thousand who live inside the Israeli state as second-class citizens, some of whom were internal refugees. When we were in Palestine in '88, one of the worst conditions we saw were not in the camps in the West Bank or Gaza, but in the town of Lidda, in a district called Manara, where people who had been Bedouin living in the Negev desert in the south, who had been driven off their land, were living in these tin shacks with naked light bulbs and with huge rats running around and children bitten by rats. And Lidda was a city which, in 1948, was an Arab city, and the Haganah rounded up the entire population in July of 1948, along with the neighboring city of Ramla, and just marched them in the desert, get out or get shot. And several hundred young men were taken to the mosque and executed, and the blood is still visible there. The Israeli state, by nature, by definition, is an apartheid state. I mean, nobody would have said in South Africa, okay, let's settle this thing. Let's have one state for the blacks and one for the whites. No, you have a democratic, multiracial South Africa, and even a binational state would be a violation of that principle of a democratic, majority-ruled state in which all people live in equality. How to achieve that? Over the last year, we spent a lot of work trying to break the blockade on Gaza, including the Viva Palestina convoys, a lot of material aid efforts. But what happened in Egypt really shows us that the essence of the struggle is the political struggle. It was really a political struggle that broke out in Egypt that has now given the best, ended the blockade, at least from on one border. And we need to wage a political struggle in this country. And it's really part of the entire struggle in this country for the redirection of our resources and economy away from war and imperialism. You know, that whether it be the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, whatever they're planning to do in Libya, you know, the sheer hypocrisy of planning airstrikes on Libya in defense of alleged human rights while they supplied the weapons that murdered 1,400 people in Gaza, including several hundred children. And the massive aid to Israel is part of one, it's all part of the military-industrial complex's domination of political life in the United States, and that's what we've got to fight against, and that's one, it's one struggle, and the struggle to get the U.S. out, to end U.S. support for Israel is a key component of that struggle. On April 9th, there's going to be a big anti-war demonstration in New York City beginning at Union Square at 12 noon, and for the first time, a major anti-war coalition has adopted as one of its demands, a broad anti-war coalition, that an end to all U.S. aid to the Israeli state. And we need activities like that. We also in Al-Auda, we work around boycott, divestment, sanctions, which may be limited because most of the aid that the U.S. government uses to prop up the Israeli state is military or military purchases or high-level corporate investment, like say by Hewlett-Packard or that has research facilities there, capital goods, but nonetheless hurting the Israeli economy to what extent possible. Israel, by the way, also, long before NAFTA, the first free trade agreement that the United States had was the U.S.-Israeli free trade agreement that was implemented under the Reagan administration, which allows duty-free access to Israeli goods to the United States market and vice versa. And then Israel has similar agreements now with Jordan and other countries, which may come to an end if there's social change in the Arab world. Egypt, under Nasser, Egypt boycotted Coca-Cola because it had a bottling plant in Israel. When we were in Egypt last year, there were pictures of Hosni Mubarak on Coke ads, like holding a bottle of Coke. That's how corrupt the regime there was.
My position on one state, two states is one of self-determination, that essentially that the Palestinians will decide what is best for their people and should be given the political, economic, and social space to do so and to implement whatever decisions that they feel is best for their people. And of course, there's no political, economic, or social space right now for the Palestinians to do that. And it's my job as someone who lives in the U.S. to provide that space, to do what I can to provide that space so that the Palestinians can have true self-determination, which is essentially getting the U.S. off their backs and stopping all U.S. aid to Israel. So I feel that in a way the one state, two state is a trap. I mean, we should talk about it, but this is the essential job of people here, to let the Palestinians have some freedom to decide what's best for them and to be able to implement it, because they have been under siege for so long and the situation has been desperate for so long, and the heroism and struggle and continued struggle has been so magnificent in the face of what they've suffered, and this story has not been told. But let's look a little bit at the recent history, of one state, two states. Arafat and Fatah, elements within Fatah, said that they would go for a two-state solution. But what happened was that permitted to be implemented. And even that was controversial and was done with a heavy heart. People felt it was abandoning the right to return, and there were many other key questions that were not addressed for it, and those who said, all right, we will take that, did it with a heavy heart. But what's happened since then? What's happened on the West Bank? The settlements, the terrible encroachment with settlements, you know, the checkpoints, the apartheid wall, that it's Israel, bankrolled by the U.S., the apartheid wall and the weapons and everything being paid for the U.S., that's making that solution impossible, you know? So let's look at the relationship of forces there. The urgent need is that the Palestinians have that space. That's always been the question. And once again, the way the media does it, like, I mean, you know, the Oslo Accords they had certain statements in them, right? There was a certain agreements in them. But Netanyahu came in, and when Sharon came in too, they said, oh, we're not gonna, we didn't sign that. We weren't the people who signed that, so we're just throwing the whole thing out. We don't have to go by that, you know? Sharon said that, and Netanyahu said that too. So what the fuck was the agreement? Pardon me. You know, what was the agreement about? That the position, and the way the media has always covered that is that position that the Israeli government has taken at the time, Sharon's position of we don't follow that, Netanyahu's position, we don't follow it. They've taken that as a central position and blamed the Palestinians for opposing it. And that's the way it's been blanketed over here, you know? So we need, when we talk about one state, two states, let the Palestinians decide that. Let's get the pressure off them. Yes, let's come together. Let's come together in every way possible to do this. We don't have to agree on one state or two state, you know? I think it's not up to us, but even if you think it's up to you, we don't have to agree to it. If we can agree, no U.S. aid to Israel, stop military aid to Israel, let the Palestinians decide. Let us come together, because we're being hurt by this. $3 million a year to Israel, $2 billion a year, $2 billion a year to Egypt to do the same thing from the other end. You know, almost $2 billion a year to Saudi Arabia to do the same thing from yet another end. Our cities are falling apart. The rest of the money's going to the banks. Let's get that money and use it for human needs. Let's talk about that. I mean, that's our right. That's my view. Yes, let's come together. My book is about building the movement in solidarity and building our own movement as well. It's meant to generate that. It's written by people who are active in that movement. Let's come together. I'm a school nurse. I mean, I'm a Lebanese American. I've been to Palestine. I've been to, you know, but I'm also a school nurse. I mean, I'm not a professional, you know, person who goes and stays in five-star hotels in the Middle East and writes about it. You know, everybody is something in this book. We are the ones who have been fighting on the streets for Palestine and for our own rights for a long time. And I say join us. Let's get together on this. There's a huge amount of injustice that's going on in the U.S. and around the world. I was looking at, well, we see what's happening in Wisconsin, you know. Here's a major assault on the right of collective bargaining. I mean, that's so basic. You know, and with the, you know, a friend of mine was doing a study yesterday about what goes with the unions. Healthcare. The unions are a big agent to push for healthcare for everyone, particularly healthcare for women, you know. And housing. The unions are a big agent for push for housing and everything else that involves quality of life. You know, it's hidden right now what the unions have done. Well, this was going unchallenged until of this little Egypt in Wisconsin. And now it's being challenged for the first time. I mean, there was a headline last month or the month before. It was when the economic news came out. Banks give themselves record bonuses, and the first quarter the banks had record profits. The number of evictions is up to record rates. The number of people without medical coverage in the U.S. is up to record rates. Who was doing anything about it? It goes on, it goes on, it goes on. The only thing that changes anything is struggle. I am convinced of that. I've been in the struggle for 40 years, and it's been a hard time. But look, 18 days in Egypt, and Mubarak came down. 30 years, a U.S. client. That's what it took. It takes mass struggle. I'm not saying that mass struggle is easy, but it is the only force for social change that is significant. These people, the banks, the military, the oil companies who do run this country, and the politicians who represent them, essentially, don't hear us at all unless they feel the hot breath of struggle on their necks, unless they're forced to be accountable. The UN can pass all the resolutions in the world, they are not necessarily enforced. You know, how many times has the US government blocked a resolution condemning Israel? The UN is another arena for struggle. What about the Goldstone report? The Goldstone report was a UN Commission report which documented the horrors of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and particularly of the 3-week Israeli bombing of Gaza and the results of it, and how it purposely targeted civilians and the deaths, and purposely targeted the civilian infrastructure and the deaths and destruction it caused. It was buried by the U.S. We cite it, I quote from it, but it's buried by the U.S. It's struggle which changes everything, and so we all right, it's hard. It's not easy, but when you look at history, that's what changed things. And we have an opportunity to see that in the Middle East right now. Let's learn from it. Let's get together. There's a new wind blowing here. Our teacher friend talked about it, you know. As I said, it's not easy, but you want to change things, we can do it.
On the question, and struggle, and that affects everything. Not only will the U.S. not end aid to Israel until it becomes too expensive for them to do that, to keep it up. They will not pull out of Iraq. They will not pull out of Afghanistan. They will not refrain from a future war against China or something that could even lead to a global Holocaust unless they are stopped. And only the people can stop the ruling class of this country and the Pentagon from the course they are pursuing. Even stopping the settlements, which is not going to happen without a tremendous struggle. And right now in Palestine, the economy is so integrated that the idea of it can't be disentangled into two states. But also, and over here you brought up the question of the right to return. That is up to the Palestinian people. We don't. No one here should be telling the Palestinian people what they should or should not accept. But the right to return does exist, and the fact is, if that is not implemented, not only will the Palestinian people still be homeless, but not only the majority of Palestinians still be homeless or living under oppression, but Israel will remain the kind of state that it is today, a racist state that will continue to attack its neighbors. I mean, it'd be like saying a white-only society could be a just or society in relation to other countries. It will continue to wage war, not only to oppress the Palestinians, but to wage war against Lebanon, and to wage war on behalf of the United States and anyone else in the region, because its interests will lie with those of the United States and not the people of the region. I don't know the situation under which your family left Iraq. Were they Jewish? Okay. I mean, the situation of the Iraqi Jews who left Iraq is kind of a tangled story. The Israeli intelligence actually bombed the Grand Synagogue in Baghdad and torched a number of Jewish shops in Baghdad and left flyers around saying, telling Iraqi Jews to get out of Iraq. This was actually an Israeli intelligence operation. And Israel then paid the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri Said, who ended his life hanging from a lamppost in 1958, paid him a large amount of money to force the Iraqi Jews to go to Israel. In fact, I know of 2 synagogues in the Arab world that were destroyed. One was the Grand Synagogue in Baghdad, bombed by the Mossad, and the other was in Lebanon, in Beirut, which in 1982 was leveled by Israeli artillery. Right now, there is a new synagogue being built in downtown Beirut with the support of Hezbollah and all the factions in Lebanon. We're seeing, after a long period of relative social peace in this country, at least from our side, we're going to be seeing, under the prevailing conditions, a growing wave of struggle, which Wisconsin is hopefully the what's the word, avatar of that, harbinger. We need to make the struggle against U.S. support of apartheid in Palestine a component of that struggle. So pro-Palestine activists should be at March 24th, should be on April 9th, should be at the Women's March on March 26th, should make Palestine visible in all the struggles that are going to be breaking out in this country against cutbacks, against war, against layoffs and unemployment, and make the struggle against U.S. aid to Israel a part of that.